Hello, and welcome to the Alliance Wealth Advisor podcast. I'm your host, Mike Cadaro. For episode number 13, we sat down with the CEO of OnePoint, Pat McMahon. We discuss how after buying the business from his dad as a young man, he grew it from $500,000 in revenue to over $26 million through a combination of organic growth and acquisitions over the years. Maybe more importantly, though, Pat talks about some of his mistakes and personal struggles along the way, including his battles with depression. Since his first experience with it after going through a divorce in the late 1970s, Pat is focused on looking internally, trying to better understand himself and the things that drive his struggles. He details how during depressions, he seems to be looking through gray-colored glasses, where everything looks dark and negative. However, he also describes what he calls his rose-colored glasses, where during manic periods, he tends to look at everything as bright and positive. He talks about the process of learning to understand this and how it has allowed him to be more balanced in his outlook and make better decisions. Pat also discusses a major turning point for the business when he bought out his partner and began to give 10% of the company's net profits to charity. He also decided to share 10% of the net profits with the company's employees as well. At that point, two things happened. First, employees became more loyal and were more bought in as they became part of something bigger that was helping those less fortunate. And secondly, Pat found a deeper satisfaction in his work and life in general. While his message may sound counterintuitive, it does make a lot of sense. The adversity he has faced in life, specifically his bouts with depression, have helped him balance his priorities. While terrible to experience, he believes they forced him to look internally and better understand himself. He thinks this made him both more content in his career and a better person. In his view, adversity forces us to sharpen our game. He also shares ways to cope with anxiety and depression that have worked for him along the way. Pat plans to continue getting out of his comfort zone, improving himself, and focusing on others as he enters a new chapter in life. And we appreciate Pat coming on to share his story in an authentic and open way. It was a great discussion. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. So Pat McMahon, thank you very much for coming on the Alliance Wealth Advisor podcast. We appreciate it, and we're happy to have you here today.
It's my pleasure.
So just to jump right in, I think where I'd like to start is just to give listeners a feel of your personal background from your perspective, both for people who may know you and those who would not. Your upbringing and how you made your way back into your family business as a young man. Maybe we could start there and then see where the conversation takes us.
Sure. Well, born and raised in Peckville, Pennsylvania. Went to Blakely High School and then the first class of Valley View, and then went on to get a marketing degree at Penn State University. A first generation on my mother's side, a first generation American. My mom was born in Gubbio, Italy. Not so much on my father's side. My father was Irish, so I'm the product of an Irish Italian marriage. And in my father's
me too.
And my father's family, it was considered a mixed marriage. They were not happy that he married an Italian. And thank God it was my mom who was the Italian, not my father, because she was a great cook. If my mother was Irish, I'm not quite sure it would have been the same meals that we would have had. But raised in a small town. Father was a serial entrepreneur. He was a sales guy, and he started a few businesses, which I typically worked at. We had to have him stop starting businesses because when he got tired after a year or two, and then he'd had the family run them. And after the third business, we said, "Listen, this is enough. Yeah. We can do it." But I started working when I was about 8 to 10 years old at his golf range, a miniature golf course, and I loved to work. I practiced while I was there. I hit a couple million golf balls over the time. And then, knew that I was probably going to go in. He had another business called Anthracite Business Forms, which was a business forms distributorship. I really liked his lifestyle. There's one year he played 200 rounds of golf, and I thought, wow, this is for me. And most of the time, he never worked past 1 o'clock. I could tell you that that never materialized for me. I never was able to do that, but I did
not many pulled that one off successfully.
In the wintertime, he'd go and play cards. He'd be down at the Scranton Club playing cards after lunch. So, and when I talk about entrepreneur, this guy built a golf range on a very high traffic highway, and he did it with virtually no money. In 1958, he sold his Mercury station wagon, whatever equity he had in that. He leased a foreign car in Scranton, Pennsylvania. A foreign car in 1958 was few and far between. And then he went out and sold shares to develop this piece of land into a golf range. And for many years, his investors were getting a 50% return on what they put into that.
Wow.
So, and then he went on to buy a warehouse, which is still the home of our company. He wanted to build an ice skating rink on that golf range property. That's when the family said, no, this is far enough. But that got me into marketing, and with the idea that I was probably going to come back and work for the family business. That was probably pretty much assumed. And
so you came right back from Penn State and jumped in?
Yeah, that wasn't my plan at first. It was a business forms company. The big business forms companies then were Standard Register and Moore Business Forms. What I wanted to do was I wanted to go into a big city, spend a couple years in a big city, and get trained by a big company. I thought the training would be a lot better there than working for my dad. But I proposed to my high school sweetheart, and we were married 3 months after we graduated.
Wow!
So that terminated any idea about going to a big city and learning a trade. So I was Dad and I were sharing an office for several years after that.
So you joined the family business, and as you know, in this podcast, we like to take deep dives to really understand how people make and made major decisions in their lives, and you sort of right out of the gates had a big one to make to join the business. It sounds like to some degree that was, predestined or assumed to some degree. But you've talked about a conversation you had with your dad in the late 70s about how you were ready to leave. So you'd been there for a few years at that point, and you were ready to go be, if my notes are correct, to go be a ski bum out west.
No, it was in Vermont.
Okay, Vermont.
But it was a short-term ski bum. It wasn't going to be a long-term ski bum. I had a plan.
So talk about that conversation,
sure,
and the plan, and maybe what the root cause of that struggle was in terms of your path.
So that was a bit of a dark period for me. That marriage that happened in 1974 ended abruptly in 76, and I was thrown into a tailspin. As I look back on that, it's probably the best thing that could have happened to me, because I was pretty much of an outward person. Anybody who knows me knows me as an extrovert. But that divorce hit me in the face real hard, and for the next 6 years, off and on, I was in a depression. The good part about that was I sought help. I sought the help of a psychiatrist because I couldn't seem to shake this depression. And it was 2 years later that I thought that maybe what I was doing was the cause of my depression. So I said to my father, I think I'm ready to go. I'm gonna go up to Vermont for this winter and be a ski lift operator and get all the free skiing I can. I'll come back and run your golf range and miniature golf course for the summer, and then I'm going to get my MBA. So there was that logical step at the end. I was going to get an MBA, which I thought would make him happy. But it was about the same time that I did go and seek the help of a psychiatrist, because the depression was really tough to shake. And after talking with him, he says, Pat, I think I hear that you might have some baggage going on with you. And he says, I think if you go to Vermont, you're probably going to take that baggage with you. He says, why don't you spend a year with me and let's take a look at that baggage? Well, that 1 year turned into 6 years. I never did go to Vermont. I stayed with the business. And the one thing my father did do, though, when I said that I was thinking about leaving, is he decided to sell me the business that was the Business Forms Company. And that changed everything, because all of a sudden I was the only person responsible for where that business was going. And when I was working for him, I'm a 20-something. I want to invest in the business. I want to grow it. And he was a 60-something, and he wanted to get cash out of the business. And that was not a good way of operating a business. So literally after buying my father out, I found a partner who was a competitor, and we merged the two companies together with the goal of growing a larger, more professional company. And it just took on from there.
So there's a couple things I want to go back to that you mentioned. I think the first one is this depression that clearly shaped you at that stage in your life. In the 1970s, I wasn't around, but I presume that there wasn't a lot of talk about mental health. No, that was something that was sort of under the surface, from what I can gather. Was that a challenge to either on your own part to seek help, or to talk about it with your father or whomever?
Well, it turns out that it's somewhat of a family disorder. My mom had really serious depressions that were debilitating. So we saw, I experienced that. He lived with it. And so there was a less of a stigma about seeking help. So I did pursue that, and I think in many cases, in many respects, it gave me a bit of a jump on life, because it turned me from being a totally outward person to a person who's a seeker. I wanted to find out what was going on and how could I stop it, because when you're in a depression, and I'm sure there are listeners out there who have gone through depression. It's a very gray time in your life. I call it my gray glasses. Now I also have a bit of a manic side. Those are my rosy glasses. So, or rose-colored glasses. So both sides are there. I've experienced the depression as recently as 2021, and they're not fun. But there usually are reasons. And when you become a seeker, a searcher, you try and find out what's going on. What's going on inside me that's causing me to have this perspective. But when you're in that, it's tough on my employees. It's particularly tough on my family and my wife. But we've gone through several of them, and fortunately now they don't last too long and they're not terribly deep. But there's still that sense of impending doom that's very hard to shake when you're in one of those depressions.
And the work life sort of balance in those times, I'd imagine is really hard in itself, right?
Well, my first partner understood. I mean, for 6 years, I would hop in the car at 6:30 in the morning and drive to Philadelphia to meet this psychiatrist, Dr. He's passed away, Dr. Max Cates, and he was a huge influence in my life. And I would be back in the office at 3:30, so it's a 2-hour drive down, 2-hour drive back.
Day. I've done that drive up and back
3:30
quite a few times.
My partner had understood. He liked the fact that I was back in the office on Monday without missing the day, and we got along very well. He was an introvert, and he loved the administration side of the business, and I was an extrovert, and I loved the sales side of the business. So we were able to specialize and grow the company that way, which we couldn't do when we were single owners.
Do you think if your dad didn't sell you the business, does that change your path?
Well, it could have. It could have, because there was a lot of conflict there in the years prior to me buying the business. We were working together for about 4 years, but Dad was ready to move on. He was I believe 35 years older than I was, so he didn't have as much of an ego tied to the business. And don't forget, we still had a warehouse and a golf range that he operated. So we just decided that we would sort of split. He would take those two, maybe I helped him a little bit, and I would take the business for his company. So I don't think he was as invested, but if he didn't, that might have caused me to go down a different path.
But that having the generation who started the business not have their ego tied even to a part of it, I think is pretty rare.
Yeah, but the serial entrepreneurs, you get an idea, you think the idea is good, you pursue it, you sort of leave behind what you've been doing before, and he literally when I joined him in '74, he had 3 successful businesses going on.
Yeah,
and he wanted me to pursue a 4th, and I refused.
3's plenty. So we'll fast forward a bit, but you and your partner and your employees, you grow this business. And sort of 1990s would be the next point in time where you hit what I would call another inflection point. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, it was another depression. It was the early 90s. From the outside, I looked like I had it all. I had a great house in the country, country club membership, beautiful wife, 2 young boys. I'd already won 2 club championships at the country club. So I think people who saw me from the outside saw that I had everything, but inside it wasn't there. I mean, inside there was another depression, and it lasted a few years. And it wasn't until I came across a continuing ed class at the University of Scranton that was taught by a Jesuit, Father George Schimmel. And along with him, he ended up becoming my spiritual director. And that was a significant inflection point because a couple things happened, especially 1997. 1997, my father died. Our 3rd child, our first daughter, was born. And my partner at the time, and we've been partners now for about 20 years. He decided to sell me his half of the business. So now I'm back in charge again, single owner of a business. We'd gone from, I think we were $1 million in sales when we merged in '80. And at that point in time, we were about $6 million in sales.
Wow!
In a small town, it was we had tripled or quadrupled our number of employees at the time. But it was with the help, and that was significant again because now it was all on my shoulders, and I sort of could do what I wanted to do. And a couple of interesting things happened. And many of them were the inspiration of Father Schimmel. We decided at that time that, and one of the things that caused that depression was, even though on the outward side it looked like I had everything, everything I was involved in was all about me. It was, our family, my business, and our whole life was all things that were directly connected to me, and we weren't other directed. And what it ended up being was, at the end result was, I was looking for meaning in my life, and I wanted to do something that was outside of a personal benefit to me. Obviously, it's important raising your family, taking care of your wife and children, having a place to live. But it all seemed self-interested. I know back in one of the things that first depression happened back in the 70s, it led me to bring an organization that was outside our area into our area, and it was called the Beginning Experience. And it was a Christian organization that ministered to divorced and separated Catholics. And we ran that for, I was involved with this for probably 7 or 8 years. One of the most meaningful things in my life, because I was able to identify and help people who were going through the same process that I went through as a divorced Catholic. It was a weekend retreat, and the team who put the weekend on, we get together on Sunday night and have dinner, and it was one of the most meaningful times of my life because we were really we saw the result over a weekend of what we were doing, helping other people get through the same things that we got through. So back in the 90s, after that, that type of social benefit was missing from my life. I was focused on my family and my business and my golf game. So it was under the direction of Father Schimmel that we started adding meaning to my life. So one of the first things we did was, as a company, we decided that we were going to give 10% of our net profits away to charity. And we still do that to this day. The other thing we decided to do was to share our profits with our support people, our inside people who were on salaries. I had a number of salespeople working for me, and as far as I was concerned, they didn't need to share in that because as they generated income or profits for us, they were generating more income for themselves.
Right.
But the support people who we all counted on were relying on annual increases, which were mostly cost of living increases. So we started sharing 10% of our net profits with the employees. Two things happened. Number one, our loyalty went through the roof. We had very little turnover, partly because of the sharing of profits, but partly because our employees liked working for a company that had meaning outside the four walls of the company. They liked being part. We actually set up a charity committee, and a lot of the decisions of where the money went to the employees on that charity committee. And I had no idea. That was going to be so important to them, but they loved being on the charity committee, and they loved giving away money. And they knew that they were part of that. They helped create some of that money. So it was a benefit that I had no idea that we were going to experience.
So right now, that's a pretty topical subject, this idea of what is the company's duty, if any, to stakeholders versus just shareholders. So how did you come up with that idea from the beginning? Because I'd imagine there wasn't a lot of your peers or people you were interacting with professionally that were doing things of that sort in the 90s, were there?
I was familiar with Tom's River. I think that was a soap company up in New England. They were giving 10% of their net profits to charity, as was Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
Okay.
They were giving 10% of their profits away to charity. And 10% goes back to the Old Testament, the tithing. And so there seemed to be precedent for it. Now now we're no longer paying two executives to run the company. We're only paying me. So there was some extra money available to do that. And it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. We even have a mission statement. Matter of fact, we still don't have a mission statement for our company, but we have a mission statement for our charity committee that sort of forms how we are going to give that money away. We do it to this day. It has not lost its appeal. As time went on, there was a book that influenced me, and that was written by another University of Scranton Jesuit, Father Bill Byron, who was the president of the University of Scranton. He's written a number of books. One of my favorite is The Power of Principles. That's LES, not ALS. And in it, for the first time, and this was in the early 2000s, the idea of stakeholders was introduced to me. As time went on, and we did acquire a few more companies, we started putting strategic plans together and writing a document for our corporate culture. And we implemented stakeholders. In our company, we have 5 stakeholders. The two most important stakeholders are our employees and our customers. Along with those two, we added our vendors. They are a stakeholder in our company because the more that we sell and produce, the better they are. We obviously added a shareholder because I was the primary shareholder, but not necessarily do we consider my position the first position. And then our community. Our community is a stakeholder in the company because as we were giving away 10% of our profits, our community was benefiting from that. So we had those stakeholders all along, but we just sort of identified them as stakeholders. And again, here we are 20 years later, still have the same set of stakeholders.
And what did that do for business?
Well, I can tell you what it did for me, and I think that helped the business, and that is it gave me the feeling that growth of our company wasn't only benefiting me and our employees, that the community was benefiting by our growth. So that gave me the desire to grow the company even further. I have to say, I probably would have stopped. I'm not a money-driven person. Like my father, I'm an entrepreneur. And like my father, I bought several businesses. But I have to tell you that money is nothing more for an entrepreneur than a report card. Was it a good idea? Did it work? And the only way you can measure whether an entrepreneur has a good idea or did it work is in the scorecard. And the scorecard is financial success.
What is your definition of entrepreneur? Is it different than what you'd pick up in the dictionary or if you Googled it?
I don't think so. I mean, I view an entrepreneur as a person who believes he has a better idea or she has a better idea. And they want the opportunity to see if that idea works, whether it's now in technology or whether it's in design of a golf club, or you want to see if you came up with the better mousetrap. And I think that's just a simple definition of an entrepreneur. But I mean, I was not, I can tell you to this day, my strengths are vision and sales, and entrepreneurship being part of it. I'm not a good manager. I wanted to grow the company big enough so I could hire managers so I didn't have to do any managing. But we were successful in doing that. But I think an entrepreneur is a person who has an idea and they want to prove that it was a good idea. So
let's go back a couple sentences there. This idea of vision. I think it has become, at least in my experience, a buzzword to many, right? These visionaries that you see in the tech world and, whether it's politics or Wall Street, right? It a lot of times becomes sort of the emperor with no clothes at some point, right? Because everyone's following this visionary. So when you say vision, how do you define that? And how does it become practical in real life versus the buzzword you hear in business school or, in the graduation speech or whatever it may be?
So vision and entrepreneurship, I think, go hand in hand. Vision is seeing an opportunity, and maybe it's an opportunity that's coming from down the road. Early on, we were in Scranton, Pennsylvania, running our company. I would travel to New England or I would travel to California, and I would see something that's going there. Well, you've been raised in Scranton too. The idea that's going there will eventually come to Scranton, but if you bring it to Scranton yourself, you look like an entrepreneur because it's not here yet, right? It's not here yet. So by bringing something to Scranton, you don't have to be a visionary. You just have to travel and see where ideas are and bring them back. That's exactly what happened with that the retreats we did for divorced and separated Catholics. I went to one of those as a hurting person. I went to Boston, experienced it. I said, I got to bring this back to Scranton, and we literally within months brought that back.
Yeah, that's interesting and correct in my experience.
If you're from Carbondale, you have a few more years.
So the thing I also have heard you say that I think relates to these depressions, which sound horrible, and I think everyone's been there in one form or another. It's all relative. But everybody can identify with that to some degree, whether they've spoken about it or not. But you've also said that adversity sharpens your game, and that these experiences, and you've highlighted a couple, when you came out of them on the other side, you came out stronger, with a clearer path of who you wanted to be and where you wanted to go. Is that a fair way to put that?
Yes, it is.
And do you think is that almost needed in life? Is adversity needed in your experience?
I think many people will tell you that some of their toughest years were the years that formed them and helped them to become who they are right now. Adversity is much like competition. When you have a monopoly, you don't have to be very sharp. You got the market cornered. I've never experienced that, by the way, but I've heard that's the truth. When you have good competitors, you have to sharpen your skills. You have to make your presentations better. You have to offer more benefits. You have to hire better people so that you're giving the customer, $1.25 worth of service for the dollar they're paying. So, yeah, I think adversity is good. And I'll be honest with you. I think depression, my depressions have all led me to making improvements in my life and my business. They force me to start looking inside. But let me also say I also have a bit of a manic side, as I mentioned with my rose-colored glasses.
Right.
And when I'm in my manic side, I'm not a very introspective person. I like things the way they are. I'm happy. I have a lot of energy, and I just keep on moving forward. But sometimes those manic periods have also led to depressions because when I'm in my manic mode, I sometimes take on more than I should take on because I think I can handle it. And then, eventually I keep on assuming things that I'm going to be able to handle that. And eventually I can't handle it. And sometimes that will start the depression too. So I think it's as important to watch yourself when you're riding a high as it is when you're in a low.
And I think it's in describing that, I hear a lot of parallels to investing.
Right.
It's never as bad as you think. Right. And it's never as good as you think either.
That's right.
And it comes down to balance and awareness in having that, whether it's an individual, whether it's a company, whether it's an investment portfolio, I think. What do you tell the person though, at the depths of, having those great glasses on, right? Just like the hardest part of my job is, in 2022 or March of 2020, 2018, in those really big down markets, telling somebody it's all going to work out is usually the worst thing you can say. So what do you tell the individual who's running a business, wants to run a business, is trying to take that next step in their life or their career, who's really struggling right now, that gets through to them?
Well, if we're talking about a depression, okay, because it's hard for me to give advice to somebody who's struggling in a business because there's lots of circumstances that can be around. But if you're emotionally struggling, all I can say is that it won't last. It will end. When you're in the middle of a depression, you think it's going to last forever, and they never do. There's always an end to it. I'm one of the things I found out early on was I thought journaling did a good job for me because, and again, when I'm depressed, I journal, and when I'm manic, I don't journal because I'm not looking for answers when I'm manic. But I'm looking for answers when I'm depressed, and journaling I found works really well. It also helps having, right now, because of COVID, it's almost impossible to find a therapist because there's so many people who have anxiety. And let me also say something I didn't realize until the last 10 years is that anxiety and depression are kissing cousins. They're almost identical when you're in the middle of it. Depressions are cyclical and they can be brought on by outside circumstances, as can anxiety. But sometimes anxiety can be short-lived, and depressions do tend to carry on. And I think obviously the wrong things to do during a depression are to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, which is one of the most common ways of getting involved with a dependency like that. Having a good friend. having a good friend that has common goals, that gets to know you, that you can open up to and discuss your weaknesses and your strengths. Because I find that talk therapy was always the best thing that I could do.
Just having that avenue to get things out, but with the idea you're trying to understand what's going on
Right.
internally.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Or just bounce ideas off. Because sometimes, I mean, sometimes the idea just sounds good to you, but it doesn't sound good to maybe somebody who's not as emotionally involved with that idea.
Right.
So I do think that it's always good to have a resource of people around you that you can talk to.
So you're clearly comfortable and enjoy introspection, trying to understand what makes you tick so you can improve it. That comes off, I think, right away in speaking to you. So you're not afraid to dive down the rabbit hole and see what's going on, or try to figure that out.
I don't look to do that, but I think depression requires me to do that. So yeah, when I'm not depressed, I live life and I enjoy life. I don't play as much golf as I used to, but I still occasionally get out there. But I also think, along with the philosophy I've learned, is it's important to help others. And I think the greatest joys I've had are when somebody else is benefiting from my perspective or my experience, and helping other people. And that's the joy that comes from doing something meaningful. And that was the whole issue back in the 90s. Everything I was doing was for me. And it wasn't until we started doing things for others that depression subsided, and you really felt true joy.
So that joy that comes from, among other things, though, is looking at your life. You have all of the stuff, right? You have all of the stuff you wanted as a young man, and you don't feel any different. Is that how you'd put it?
Yeah, absolutely. I in a way, maybe even worse, because you've been pursuing these in the first half of your life, and you have them all, and you're not happy.
Yeah.
You're looking for, okay, what's wrong? What's missing? And because what society told me was important, I have. And I'm still not happy. Well, why is that? And that ended up being meaning. Back in the 90s, I added meaning to my life through various avenues. And that meaning is still there today. So I think that's where we need to have a society that is focused on not only taking care of their own needs, but taking care of the needs of others.
I think what's interesting is in listening to your unique journey through this, and I appreciate, how open you're, willing to be about it's a hard topic, and a lot of people, not only do they not want to speak about it, I think people struggle, but myself included, by the way, to acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah.
Because I think right now, you mentioned mental health and anxiety and depression and how common it is, but a lot of it, I think, goes back to people questioning a lot of things during COVID, where you had to take a step back and say, is this what I want to be doing, or where am I at? You had to take a self-assessment. What do you tell people having that internal dialogue?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to have that internal dialogue. I think without that internal dialogue, you're denying a part of who you are. And again, I think alcohol and drugs get in the way of that internal dialogue, because all of a sudden you're not talking to the person that's inside you. You're talking to something else. And I think but I have to tell you, in the 90s, when I was going through that depression, I was thinking, okay, I want to help people. I wanted to become an Episcopal priest. Okay. I thought that would be a good road for me, because I was married, and I liked the spiritual side of things. Couldn't become a Catholic priest because I was married. So I thought Episcopal priest was going to be good. Or then I also thought about becoming a chiropractor, because chiropractors help people. And then I went through it and I said, okay, how could I get what I want? And that is helping others by not cause my family so much distress. Obviously, if I became an Episcopal priest, my income dries up. I have to take a couple of years and study. Same with being a chiropractor. It can't just happen tomorrow. It's going to take years of study. And that's why I thought, how about if I become a business person who runs a business that is of benefits to society? I thought, I'm already good at being in business. I think it's important to help society. Let's take those two and make them one. And we took a $6 million company and turned it into a $28 million company, all the time giving away 10% of our net profits. So, and I've gotten as much satisfaction, I think probably more satisfaction in doing that than if I had become a minister.
There's this idea from our last guest, Tom Morgan, about like, you want to be in a rock band, but you stink of the guitar. Like you need, you want to follow a passion, but you can't just have these knee-jerk reactions to, overcorrecting. You need to listen to what reality is telling you, like this idea of it being conversational. And so you had to figure out, okay, those would then just be other extensions of doing them for me.
Right.
So you had to take that and then built an incredible business through that lens. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about on this topic of shareholders and, corporate character, and I'm looking at your document in front of you, is it's like I mentioned earlier, it's become pretty common, at least in terms of the language being used, whether it's the investing world, ESG funds, corporate governance, making sure that you're socially responsible. If it's different months in the year, the corporations need to make sure they acknowledge it. All of those things are fine. Do you think, though, there is an element of window dressing in this movement today, where maybe the actions aren't meeting the language when it comes to corporate America and that investing class and how they're positioning corporations and companies?
Well, sustainability is something that's going to be important for any type of company, even one who's publicly traded. There has to be a sustainability statement that the company has. It's much more difficult doing what we do if we were publicly traded. I'm not worried about what our shareholders think about us. Many times, and I'd say the bulk of shareholders are investing in return. I think this has to be led by courageous CEOs who have a vision and get involved to a point that's not going to harm their bottom line, but potentially help their bottom line by creating an atmosphere in the country or in their company that's positive, having a good environmental statement, trying to be less of a polluter. I know you hear that from the gas industry. They're talking about how they're seeking ways of being more environmentally concerned. But they're the gas industry. I mean, their goal is to sell gas. They can only go so far. Some of them are turning to electric. I happen to drive a electric car. I have an electric boat. That's my statement because I'm doing that without paying much of a price for it. But I do believe that it's much harder as a public organization. There's a lot of pressure on the bottom line and maximizing the bottom line. And as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the problems our country has is short-term thinking and what's the quarterly numbers look like. Because having a statement that is socially responsible is long-term. You don't all of a sudden become a socially responsible company. We've been a socially responsible company now for 25 years. And you do have to, stick to the knitting, and you do have to make sure that you're taking care of the business. But at the same time, that there's benefits for the whole community when you do stick to it.
I think the word that we use at Alliance that speaks to this is you need to have alignment with your stakeholders and with decision makers and with employees to say, are we all on the same side of the table here, aiming for the same thing? Community, clients, vendors, employees, right? If there's misalignment, then you have misaligned incentives, and it's really hard to move in the same direction. And that short-term thinking, I think, misaligns incentives, or is caused often by misaligned incentives, right?
Yeah. I won't mention a large bank, but I believe a large bank in our country has had that same problem, and they're paying a fortune to try and change that particular image.
So the other question I had was, and I mentioned it a little bit, but you've done a fair amount of personal development work, let's call it. I would say more than the average person. At least it sounds like from what I understand. How can listeners interested in taking a practical step or two to begin their own version of a journey you've had, or for self-improvement, or to come out of that depression, or to have less anxiety about the future? What are things that you have done or learned along the way that have helped you that are sort of broadly applicable?
Well, again, let me just say that I wasn't necessarily looking for answers. I was forced into a psychological attitude, or a psychological position, where I was forced to look for answers, because the pain I was enduring was so great. I didn't want it to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you don't have a depression, do you really want to go down that rabbit hole? I don't know that I would. I don't know that I would have the energy.
That's a fair point.
But when there's pain, there are ways of dealing with pain, healthy ways of dealing with pain. And there are lots of people out there, whether they be a spiritual director, or a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, or a wife, or I think being honest with how you feel. I think journaling is a great way of trying to catch how you feel, because sometimes I find that I'm amazed at what happens when I just stop editing my journals and thinking about, oh, what if somebody reads this? I don't worry about that. I just write it, and I find amazing insight when I write in my journals. So that's an easy one. You don't need it. But I also think surrounding yourself with people that you admire, people that you respect. And let me just say that I think one of the first things a person needs to do on a business track is to define success for them. When you hear somebody say, well, that person, really successful person, what do you think? You think money.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
100%.
Right. You think money. And I got to tell you, if that's your definition of success, you're going, as they say, you're climbing the wrong ladder. I think success is a balance of things. Success is taking care and interest in your family, loving your family, literally loving your employees. And I say that word, loving your employees. I have to watch saying that. There's, and I showed, I matter of fact, I think I gave you a copy of this book, Heroic Leadership by Chris Lowney.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're interested in, this was a man who was seeking a spiritual life and decided that he was going to then go and have a more of a secular life. And he was an all-star for JP Morgan. And after he made a certain amount of money, he left JP Morgan. The first thing he did was he wrote a book about heroic leadership and the 4 pillars of success. Now I have to make sure I remember all 4 of those pillars of success. But the very first one, he was actually studying to become a Jesuit. And the Jesuits are very interested in self-awareness. The very first pillar is self-awareness. You have to know who you are and what makes you tick. The second one is ingenuity, because every good business needs ingenuity. The third was heroism. Be willing to take on heroic tasks, heroic challenges. Don't back away from them. And the fourth is love. And Chris even mentions in the book, he's a bit embarrassed about making a pillar for a successful business, love. But what he's talking about there is acting in a loving attitude toward your employees, towards your customers. And what that means is caring. It doesn't, he's not talking about anything that's inappropriate. He's talking about caring for others as one of the four pillars of success. I've actually spoken a couple of times on that. Love as a pillar for a successful business. And it's gotten very good reaction, because people don't think of love as a pillar for a successful business.
I think too, the words can immediately turn people off based on prior experiences they've had or cliches, or,
Right.
They've heard it so many times it becomes noise. So like spirituality, anything sort of down that avenue can make someone turn into a cynic as they're listening. And it's really just a function of the limitation of the definition. Of the
I agree 100%. I think, again, Chris was studying to become a Jesuit priest. So I think he was very comfortable with the word love. And one of the things I do when I speak on love as a pillar for success, I do a definition. It means acting, and Chris has a definition for it right early on. So you're not going down that.
Sure.
I highly recommend that book for somebody who's interested in developing a similar culture to ours.
So, as you look forward, what you've mentioned a few things, and this idea of finding meaning a while back, growing the company, being able to and wanting to grow it more because after finding it played a big role. What's next for you as you look ahead, business or personal? How do you want to spend your time in this chapter in your life?
Well, I've just started a new chapter. I tried to start it 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, and I couldn't do it then because of COVID hitting. I couldn't go to a part-time position with my company, so I stayed. What we've done is we've sold one of our companies back in December, and I started an 18-hour week, 6 hours a day, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. I'm still the CEO of OnePoint. I've hired some very qualified management people to run it, and so I started my next chapter. I've become a CASA volunteer. That's a court-appointed special advocate for kids who end up in the legal system through no fault of their own.
Wow!
Through their and what happens is these kids fall through the cracks. There are people who are watching over them. There's caseworkers, but there's just not enough caseworkers to go around. And in many cases, the parents aren't capable of being a responsible parent. So the CASA member is assigned to 1, 2, 3 children. And as a CASA member, the best interest of that child is what we're looking for. It's way different than anything I've ever done in my life.
I bet.
But it's also very rewarding. So that chapter has just started for me, and I look forward to some whole new experiences.
So, would you say in these different? So we talked about jumping into the family business, growing the family business, pivoting towards a different definition of what that family business was, and now this next chapter. It sounds like each time you sort of looked inward and started focusing on others in various forms, you've had more success that have pushed you forward.
Yeah. I think this one, though, when you say, again, success, if you're talking financial success, I don't anticipate that this one's going to lead to any success.
Yeah,
any financial
I
success.
didn't think so.
This one is all about others.
But maybe instead of success,
joy,
fulfillment,
happiness,
fulfillment.
Yeah. I agree, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in that. If you remember, I said back when we were doing the divorced and separated retreats back in the 70s and 80s, at the end of every one of those retreats, there was just a sense of joy that we had a good weekend and that people really benefited. People who were struggling with their position with the church for 15, 20 years, all of a sudden were cut free in how they viewed themselves. They're no longer out there on an island. There's a group of people who are with them and supporting them. And that feeling of joy by seeing people being benefited from the work that we were doing, it's hard to replace that. And now that's hopefully, I'm not looking for, immediate joy coming back from my current volunteer job. But I just feel that it's the right path. I've been a very, very fortunate person in my life. Even with the depressions, I still consider myself a very fortunate person. And it's time to start giving back.
Do you think that fulfillment, to have true success, you need fulfillment, and does fulfillment often come at the expense of that material success?
It hasn't for us, my family. It hasn't for us at all. There are so many people out there who have dedicated their lives to other people, nurses, social workers. Right now in Lackawanna County, there's 23 positions open for social workers.
Wow.
There's just a need for those people. These people who work in nonprofits like United Way and Food for the Friends of the Poor, Community Intervention Center, these people are working at probably less than going wage rates.
Certainly.
And they're devoting their 40, 50, or 60 hours a week to helping others. We were given 10% of our net profits to charity. Come on. I was spending 95% of my time growing the company, knowing that there was a benefit, and that was good enough for me at the time. But now that I'm ready to move on to another level of fulfillment and helping others. And hopefully I can handle it. Hopefully I can be responsible enough without causing me more anxiety.
So, my last question, which may lead to a couple follow-ups, but the question I've asked every guest who's come on the podcast so far is, so knowing all that you know now, experienced everything that you've experienced, some of which we've talked about here today, what is the one piece of advice you'd give to that 22-year-old version of yourself?
Okay. I think a couple of things. One is balance is important. And that means balancing all aspects of your life. When I was 22, one of the most important things in my life was my golf game. I was known way more for my golf than I was for my business. But, balancing your athletics, your business. I'm going to say that first half of life is really about building that cup that we talk about, the cup that's going to hold the contents. It's about getting an education. It's about learning to live with people. It's about relationships, building a family, getting a house. And that's really predominantly external, and that's necessary. But at the same time, it doesn't have to exclude those things that are going to be important to you in the other half of life. One of my salespeople, when I hired him at 25, he was a big brother. He was doing that, a couple days a month, being a big brother. I thought that was incredible that he was giving away his Saturdays to be a big brother. I think things like that, getting involved with just one nonprofit and just helping them out, even, doing some volunteer work here and there. I think that adds some balance to your life early on. And I think you can pursue that more as you find the rewards for that actually mean more than maybe a 5% increase in your pay. Those rewards will be lifelong rewards. And I think in the second half of your life, you can pursue that more actively because as far as I'm concerned, I get more joy out of that part of my life than I do making money.
Pat, thank you so much. This was great. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. But I think, our listeners are going to enjoy this, and I know I certainly did. So thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
The information on this podcast was created by Alliance Wealth Advisors and published for informational purposes only. The guest on this episode was not a client at the time of this interview and did not receive any compensation. For more information, please visit alliancewealthadvisors.com.